There we are. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along today. So today we're very excited to hear from Claire Essex, who is one of our colleagues at the Centre for Brain and Cognitive Development at Bikbeck, where she's currently in her final year as a PhD student. So Claire did her BSc in psychology at Bikbeck in 2017 and her MSc in educational neuroscience just across the road at the UCL Institute for Education in 2018. Her PhD research has been funded by an ESRC Industrial Challenges studentship and has been conducted in partnership with the children's media platform Hopster. And I'll pop the link for Hopster in the chat. So Claire's research focuses on how the content of media influences the allocation of attention and a child's ability to comprehend and learn from what they watch. So we're going to hear about it right now. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks so much, Astrid. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really great to be here. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of my PhD research with you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about kids' TV. So you've probably noticed that kids' TV is rather different to adult TV. So it often includes talking animals, it tends to be overly bright, and there's often something quite odd about the way the characters look. So really big heads, tiny bodies, often with bulging eyes. And plus, for us grown-ups, we often find it really difficult to see what is so appealing. And so in this talk, what I'm going to tell you is that that's because child-directed content has evolved to overcome the limited cognitive skills that the child viewer possesses. And by doing so, the content creators are increasing a child's ability to comprehend and learn from the characters and the worlds that they see on screen. But there's also occasions where this may not be the case, and that this likely changes as children grow and develop. So I wanted to say that although I'll be focusing on properties which are in kids' TV, these features that I'm talking about are not only found in TV shows, they're also embedded in other media formats, so things like games, educational content, etc. When we think about developmentally appropriate content, I'm sure what comes to mind is things like appropriate language, imagery or themes, and these are things that would really be encompassed within an age rating system for TV and film. But I want to sort of put these to one side and instead focus on how visual narratives can be constructed. So we all know that a story can be restructured to make it more appropriate for the age of the audience. So for example, when telling toddlers the story of Little Red Riding Hood, we might choose to brush over the fact that grandma gets eaten. But for bloodthirsty 10-year-olds, right, we may give a more graphic retelling of grandma's demise. So what my research is focusing on is the visual features in TV and film that facilitate these kinds of differing modes of delivery. So as I've touched on really briefly already, the colour, luminance and contrast of kids' TV has been heightened. There's also differences to the scale of shots that are used and the duration of the shots. And these are intentional differences which the content creators are using to help deliver their message. So why might they be doing this? So we know from research that children have impoverished skills for processing screen-based content. So it's not until roughly 18 months that children are able to differentiate between scrambled TV footage and unscrambled TV footage. And even by 4 years of age, children are still showing what's called a video deficit effect. So this means that they're struggling to transfer what they learn on screen into the real world and vice versa. And in fact, it's only really from about 12 years of age that children start to show a more adult-like understanding of the scenic conventions which are used in TV and film. So because of this, content creators have developed a scenic language which I say is unique to children's TV. So, for example, they'll adjust the shot scale and shot length to account for the poor attention control and limited processing speed that young viewers have. So they're slowing down the flow of the new information, and by focusing on mid-scale shots and close-ups, they're reducing the distraction that's present in the rest of the scene. They can also use colour and contrast to distinguish between the foreground and the background, and they also accentuate facial features. So this is what I'm talking about, these sort of big heads, bulging eyes, wide mouths. These are all used to act as a signal to show young viewers that this is the most relevant area of the shot for them to look at. So by supporting children's limited skills for understanding the content, they're hoping that they're extending the engagement and increasing the opportunities to learn. But how do we establish as researchers what's developmentally appropriate? We know that the content creators and the broadcasters want lots of children to see their content, but also parents, for example, want to be able to make informed choices about the content that their children are accessing and how they might tailor this based on the age and development of their child. And equally for educators who want to be able to incorporate educational content into their classrooms, they're going to have those similar kinds of considerations. So how well children can process and comprehend the content they're viewing is going to differ with age, and we need to work towards an approach which is able to quantify content in terms of the demands that it's placing on children's developing cognitive skills, and considering how these change with age. So I wanted to focus a bit more on the research that exists in terms of children's TV viewing. So there's been a long history of research on TV viewing during childhood, but the majority of it has tended to look at correlational relationships and over long term. So for example, there's evidence which suggests that the more time children spend viewing media content early in life, the more likely they are to experience difficulties maintaining attention, suppressing unnecessary distractors, and rising to the demands that are placed on them in the classroom. That said, some studies have failed to replicate these associations, and often they point to a much more complex mix of factors. So this is things like the general family media environment. So these are things like background TV, where the parents are co-viewing content with their children. And it also seems that it may be particularly high levels of viewing that are problematic. So we need more experimental work. And there are several approaches you could take to experimentally trying to understand this relationship between children's TV viewing and their developing attention skills. So you could manipulate exposure, but this is going to be really difficult to achieve. And it's also not going to tell you about the possible mechanisms that are going to underlie that relationship. Or you can take an approach which we have done with my PhD research, which is to manipulate a specific exposure or a specific piece of content and then test that specific short-term outcome. And then we can start to ask, how does TV viewing affect children's attention skills? And there are some studies which have done this already. So there was some prominent work done by Lillard and colleagues, where they tested the short-term impact of viewing different TV cartoons on children's executive functions, and this was in preschool age children and school age children. And what these studies typically do is they show children different sets of TV shows, and they look to see how well they perform on batteries of behavioural tasks which are going to tap components of executive function. So I'm sure we'll all be familiar with executive functions, but I just want to give a description of what these skills are. So they allow us to deploy our behaviour in a goal-directed manner, and they can broadly be understood to encompass attention control, working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. And these are crucial skills for succeeding in school and also in many other scenarios which require us to control our behaviour. And so what Lillard and colleagues found was that performance was reduced on a battery of tasks which were tapping these executive functions after children viewed some TV shows, but not others. And these depletion effects, as they have called them, were attributed to formal content features. So these are things such as pace, which I've already touched upon. So how fast the content's being delivered. And obviously, generally this is driven by cuts. And then more general content features such as fantastical content. So over a series of studies, they appeared to isolate the effects that they found to fantastical content. And so this fantastical content is violations of physical laws. So impossible transformations, things that children will see as something that can't happen in the real world. And they've proposed a couple of non-mutually exclusive hypotheses for these effects that they found. The first of these is that the novelty of the fantastical events is going to bias the viewer to processing content in a bottom-up fashion, and that this limits a practice of endogenous attention. So being exposed to content which you don't have to actively determine your viewing behavior over is sort of taking away the possibility that you practice this endogenous attention. And it's problematic because endogenous attention is going to be critical for the deployment of those goal-directed behaviors that you're going to need in order to do well on executive function tasks. The other hypothesis that they propose is that the effect actually lies further up the processing stream when the cognitive resources of the child have been exhausted attempting to encode these novel, unfamiliar events. And I'll talk about these in a lot more detail as we go through the talk. But I just wanted to flag at this point a couple of theoretical issues with this account that's been put forward. So the first of these really relates to this bias towards bottom-up attention. And really, because what this is suggesting is it's more of the long-term issue. So it's not the short-term thing that they were testing, this reliance on exogenous drivers of attention, a reliance on the stimuli to drive your attention for you is the thing that you're basically building up over time and is then contributing to issues with concentration and distractibility. And then the other issue with this is that there's a lack of formalization of the specific properties. So there's a suggestion that this bottom up is maybe pace, but they haven't formalized the specific properties. So there's a question, if it is a bias for low-level features, what are the specific features and why are they having that impact? And then there's a secondary question, which is at what stage of processing does an executive function system become overwhelmed? What are the constituent parts of the fantastical events which overwhelm this system? And I'm going to talk a bit more about that as we go through. So I just wanted to, before I get into the next stage of the talk, I just wanted to say that I'm going to break this talk down a little bit into parts. So the first part is going to be work that we've done to better understand these short-term effects that I've been discussing. And then I'll talk about how we've tested for those short-term effects. And finally, I'll spend some time talking about future directions, so the possible mechanisms which might underlie short-term effects and how we might look for causal links between the short-term and the long-term. Okay, so I've created this visualization, and really this is just to summarize what I've talked about. So we can order the effects that have been shown previously in the literature in terms of a sort of temporal ordering. So this goes from the short term to the long term. So the purple arrows here are indicating the pathways for which there is already some evidence of. So we know from the experimental evidence that there appears to be this short to mid-term effect of viewing on children's ability to perform well on these executive function tasks. And then there's also the correlational evidence, which takes us from the TV viewing to more long-term effects, which are manifest as increased distractibility, reduced concentration, and these are reported by parents and teachers. And then there's another possible pathway, which I've put here in green, which hasn't been investigated yet. And this is what links the short-term effects with the long-term effects. And so one possibility is that through repeated experience with features which overwhelm the executive function system and prevent children being able to call upon those skills after viewing, that this may have a cumulative effect. And so over time, it's going to shift those short-term changes, which we could call state changes, towards trait changes. But there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge at the moment, so we don't understand in what ways the shows which have been used previously have differed in terms of their visual features and the demands placed on the viewer. We only know about short-term effects in preschool and school-age children, but the correlational evidence is suggesting that in actual fact, it's the very young viewing that's particularly detrimental. And so that's an area that needs to be addressed. And we also don't know whether the effects which have previously been reported would still be present if we were to control for the other confounding factors which are in the content. And I'll talk a bit more about this later. So in order to address some of these questions, I have the two research questions that my PhD is focusing on. So the first of these are, what are the short-term effects of specific content features on children's executive functions? And the second is, are these effects attributable to a single dimension? So for example, fantastical content, or is there a more complex interplay between the narrative complexity and the visual properties? Okay, so I'm next going to walk you through the work that we've done to better understand the short-term effects that have been found in the literature previously. Okay, so to improve our understanding of the factors which influence executive function during and after viewing, we need a theoretical framework that's going to be able to formalize the content properties of a TV show and then help to make clear predictions about which shows will impact executive function. So we've used the scene perception and event comprehension theory, which this is the figure here is illustrating this theory, and it's a theory of visual narrative processing. And we've used this to reevaluate the shows which Lillard and colleagues had used in their studies. So this has involved formalizing and quantifying individual content properties and then making predictions about what would be most prevalent in shows which have previously been shown to reduce children's executive functions. I don't want to spend too much time talking through this figure of spec, but there are some key components that I just want to highlight because these run through our lab work as well. So the spec framework is distinguishing between front-end processes which occur during a single fixation or attention period, and these involve selecting where to attend and what information to abstract. And then there's back-end processes which are accumulating information over much longer time periods and multiple eye fixations. So the front-end processes can either be driven by the stimulus, so they can be exogenous, or they can be driven by the back-end processes, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. So these can also be endogenous. And then so there's an obvious trade-off there between the two, and this is handled by the executive processes. And you can see in this figure here, these are attention control, inhibition, and goal setting. So in order to successfully comprehend the narrative, a viewer is going to need to engage in a continuous process of building and maintaining event models, which can then be moved through the system to long-term memory and are then representations that can be called upon in the future, either during the ongoing program that they're engaging with or future programs. So to achieve this, the executive processes are going to need to monitor the incoming visual and perceptual features and detect when the information that's held in working memory no longer matches that incoming visual information. So for example, the location has changed, we've had a change of camera angle. These are the kinds of things that are going to be detected and signal that the representation that you're holding in memory no longer matches. And so this is a complex coordination. And it places a significant load on the executive processes. And this is really important when we think about the impact of fantastical events and how these may be overwhelming the executive function system. I also wanted to say it's important when we're considering this framework to also bear in mind the developmental differences which will exist in how well children are able to process visual narratives and their constituent features. So the mechanisms that you can see here, which are implicated in SPECT, undergo large functional changes during the preschool years, and they're not actually adult-like until at least adolescence. And this is important because while the EF system is still organizing itself into a coordinated hierarchy, there's a heavy cost that's involved in coordinating those dissociable components as they are when children are younger. And so I want to highlight this because this will interact with the challenge that's going to be presented by processing the visual narratives. Okay, so to understand how the content choices which had been used previously by Lillard and colleagues may differ, we formalised properties which had been implicated in their model of TV viewing but hadn't been specified. So the first of these were stimulus level features, which are known to drive attention in a bottom-up fashion. And so here we have flicker, which is a difference in luminance over time, and this is measured frame by frame. And I've got some videos here which I'll show you, which will show you how this looks in real time. And we have edge density, which is really the complexity of the image, so how easy it is to pinpoint areas of interest in an image. And then we also have pace, so which I've already talked about, is how fast the content is being delivered. And so we have average shot length for this. And so for all three of these, we expected to find greater levels of these in videos which had been shown to deplete executive function after viewing. So here's a video. So what you can see here, hopefully, is this is an episode of Caillou. So this was a TV show that Lillard and colleagues used, which didn't seem to reduce executive function after viewing. You can see it's quite a simple illustrated cartoon. There are some changes, but these are quite gradual, and each of our waveforms there are different measures of the level of activity that's happening in the shot. If I then show you SpongeBob SquarePants, so this is another show that they used in their studies, and this show did have an impact on executive function. You can see that the changes are much more rapid, and we're getting less periods of relative constant in our visual scene. So the second feature that we formalized along with these stimulus level features were the novel fantastical events. And so these will primarily influence the back-end processes in working memory. And I'll go into more detail about this in the next section. And so when you essentially detect these changes, resources are allocated to update the event model based on the amount of change that's occurring. And so situational change is really the amount of change which occurs across action, space, and time in a TV or film. And it predicts the likelihood of perceiving an event boundary and therefore triggering the formation of a new event model. So the problem with fantastical events is that they may erroneously trigger event boundaries, and that then leads to an incoherent event representation being moved to long-term memory. And so again, I'll talk about this a bit more, but for the purpose of this secondary analysis, we coded this rate of situational change with an event indexing model, which was developed by Magliano and colleagues. And we predicted that there would be a greater rate of situational change in the shows which had previously reduced executive function performance. So we categorized the shows that had been used previously in terms of the effect that was obtained, so either EF depleting or non-EF depleting. And what we found was that the EF depleting shows, which you can see here are the grey bars, had higher levels of flicker, edge density, and situational change. So this suggests that the effects that were found previously were being driven by a combined influence of the visual features with this greater rate of situational change. What we also did was look at a composite feature score. So this is combining all of our individual features to look at the overall presence in each of the shows. And so here we have Z scores, which have been summed to give an overall feature score for each of the TV shows. And you can see here that the pattern is indicating a greater prevalence of those cognitively demanding properties for the EF depleting shows. And I'm now going to carry these through into our lab-based work that we've done to see whether we can show short-term effects of TV viewing are attributable solely to these fantastical events. Okay, so really quickly, just to talk through our model of executive function during TV viewing. So Drawing on the work that we've done previously, we make a distinction in terms of levels of TV content. So we have two distinct levels. These are the formal features, which I've talked about. So we have pace, motion, and image complexity. And then we have the top-down content features, which in this case is the novel fantastical events. And the purpose of our lab-based study is to isolate those novel fantastical events from the other features. So we are endeavoring to hold the formal features, these bottom-up features, constant in order to test specifically the impact of the fantastical events. So novel unfamiliar events are going to introduce a challenge to this model, which we've already started looking at, which is taken from this SPECT framework. And they'll do this in a number of ways. So it will be difficult for children to build and maintain a coherent event model when they see these novel unfamiliar events. And so integrating the novel event with existing knowledge representations is going to be very difficult. As a result, they may persist in attempting to align those things and then miss out on other key narrative information in the scene. It's also cognitively very demanding to have this process of trying to align these things, and it will constrain the executive control processes, which, as I mentioned earlier, are acting as that filter between our stimulus features, attention selection, and the event model mechanisms. The other problem with fantastical events is that they're going to signal an error within the current event model, which will trigger the reassessment of low-level visual features. So what this does is it increases the likelihood that children are going to build fragmented representations of the narrative, and this is going to disrupt processing of future events as it gives them unreliable information to call upon when they see those similar events in the future. So then, as the task of understanding these novel events overwhelms the system, children may then default to a low-level processing of the visual scene. So to test this theoretical model, we devised an experimental study which would allow us to hold the formal features constant, as I've mentioned, across viewing conditions, and therefore test the specific impact of fantastical events with objective measures of emerging EF skills. And what we theorize is that novel fantastical events are going to overwhelm executive attention processes. And by this, I mean that there'll be an impairment on attention control. So this will be the trade-off between exogenous and endogenous processing. And also it will impact sustained attention. So this is the maintenance of attention in the absence of a low-level visual cue. And so to tap this trade-off that occurs between the exogenous and the endogenous, we have a number of tasks that we're using. So we have an infant anti-saccade task. So children will need to inhibit looks to a distractor and look towards a target location instead in order to get a reward. We're also using free viewing of static scenes in order to measure their sustained attention. So how well they're able to maintain attention to the scene. And we've included a behavioural task. So because our children are toddlers and not preschool age children, the behavioural tasks that we generally use to test executive function aren't appropriate. So what we've used is one that we think is more suited. So this is a behavioural task. It's taken from the LabTab protocol. And it's a block task, and it's used to examine the engagement during play. So we use this as an additional proxy of sustained attention, which wasn't screen-based. So we have the following hypothesis and predictions. I'll talk a bit more about each task as we come to it, but we're predicting that the fantastical content is going to impair goal-driven executive processing. For LabTab block task, this is going to manifest as shorter durations of engagement during play. On our anti-saccade task, we'll see fewer anti-saccades for the fantastical condition. And in the static scene viewing, we expect to see shorter average fixation durations from pre to post viewing for the fantastical condition. And so just to quickly run through our participants, we had 36 children. They were 18 months of age. They came into the lab twice, approximately 1 week apart, and they saw both sets of cartoons that we've created, which I'll go through in a minute. This is an outline of the structure of the protocol. So we have tasks that we ran before the cartoon viewing, during the cartoon viewing, and afterwards. And as I've mentioned, this is within subjects, so everybody saw both conditions, and we adapted the task to control for the learning effects which we would get from repeating them. So to show you the cartoon stimuli that we created, we have two conditions, and these were created from Looney Tunes cartoons. So we match fantastical with non-fantastical, and our fantastical events are violations of solidity, cohesion, continuity. We have 8 clips in each block, and these are shown 3 times, and we pseudo randomize the ordering of the clips because we didn't want children to be able to anticipate the events. So to show you the fantastical first.
It goes into a finale. And what a finale! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
And this is the non-fantastical.
I am hunting full, giddy up, giddy up, giddy up. My horse and I are of the finest breed. Giddy up, giddy up, giddy up. Just like the wind, I ride right forward to thee. Sure of foot, sure of eye. Peeling onions make me cry. This makes no sense, so do I. So don't you go and beat me, Daddy, to the nearest bar. Yeah. Operator, operator! Hey, you got a nickel? Hello, operator, operator! Give me walnut treat.
Okay, and because I always think it's nice to see what this looks like when a little person is viewing them, I've got some footage here of, this is one of the participants who was viewing the Fantastical cartoon, and you can see the gaze behavior moving over the top of the cartoon there. And the nice thing about showing them something that's visually appealing is they like to look at it. And this was a very compliant participant. Okay, great. So the first task that I want to present to you is the lab tab block task. So this task is the one that's most akin to the behavioural measures that have been used previously in the literature. So we give the children a selection of Duplo blocks to play with, and we leave them for 3 minutes to play with them. And then looking and manipulating behavior is coded continuously across that 3-minute task time. And from this, we abstract 2 measures of sustained attention. So we have duration of longest continuous look and duration of longest continuous period of combined looking and manipulating. So this is the periods when the children are actively looking and playing with the blocks. And what we're predicting is that we will see shorter durations of longest look and longest period of combined engagement for the fantastical condition. And this is because of this impact on their endogenous attention control, so they won't be able to sustain their attention for as long. Okay, so as with all of our tasks, we used generalized estimating equations to test the effects of the condition. And so here we have 36 participants who were included in the analysis. The plots that you can see here, I'll just quickly talk you through them. So plot A is the longest look duration. Plot B is the longest combined looking and manipulating. The mean is shown as a diamond, the error bars are the standard error of the mean, and we have the median, which is the solid black line, and each dot is an individual duration. So when we enter condition as a predictor of duration of looking or engagement, we find no condition difference on either of our measures. Descriptively, we can see that the durations are longer in the fantastical condition, and that is not what we would have predicted. So we don't see any evidence of reduced engagement in the fantastical condition, but there are a couple of caveats to this. So we haven't controlled for previewing with this task. The children only did it once and they did it at the end. And so there's also a timing issue there. So the task was completed about 10 minutes after the end of the final cartoon viewing. That said, our next steps are to look at the off-task behaviour, looking at the possibility of increased distractibility, and we're also interested in how the looking behaviour changed across the task time. So as the task progressed, the novelty of the task will have worn off, and this should mean that children become less engaged as the task progresses once they've reached a point where they are familiar with the blocks that they've given them. So we're interested to know whether we see a difference in terms of information processing between our two conditions. So these are just a couple of things that we intend to look at. So I'm next going to talk about our infant anti-saccade task. This task we've used because it taps exogenous and endogenous attention, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So it lends itself well to disentangling the levels at which the fantastical events may be impacting children's attention control. So I'll just talk through the task really quickly for anybody who's not familiar with it. So it's a gaze contingent task, and it's used to teach infants to look to a target location without looking to a distractor. And children are rewarded with an appealing animation when they look to the target. So let me show you the visualization. So you'll see here in this video, we have a black dot, which is the distractor. And before the cartoon animation appears, there's a red dot. The quicker that the children look, there's the red dot there. So the quicker that the children look to that location, the quicker they get the reward. And what we can do is we can abstract a number of measures from this looking behaviour. So if a child makes an anticipatory look to the target, so this is not looking to the distractor, looking straight to the target location, before that red dot appears, we would categorise that as an anti-saccade. If the child looks towards the distractor without making an anticipatory look to the target, then this is categorised as a pro-saccade. And then the final saccade behaviour that we have is a corrective look. So these are looks where the children will look to the distractor, but still manage to look to the target location before the onset of the target. And then from these, we then have our measure of exogenous attention, which is the pro-saccade, and endogenous attention, which is the anti-saccade. So in our study, we had 4 blocks. There was 15 trials per block, and these were interspersed with the cartoons that I've shown you. The first block is used as a baseline, and we counterbalance the target side for each of the children. So to work through the results that we've got, so you can see in the plot here that it's broken down into the saccade behaviours. So we have anti-saccade, pro-saccade and corrective saccades. We've baselined these scores. So scores which are above 0 are ones that are increasing relative to baseline, and ones that are below 0 are the ones where we're decreasing those behaviours relative to baseline. The conditions were matched at baseline, and we use a number of valid trials as a covariate to control for data quality. We enter condition and block as predictors of our saccade behaviour. And just to remind you, we're expecting to find fewer anti-saccades for the fantastical condition because this is the measure of endogenous attention. And so we do find fewer anti-saccades after the fantastical content, but this didn't reach significance. The proportion of anti-saccades is increasing with block, But when we look at a condition by block interaction effect, what we see is that in actual fact, this proportion of anti-saccades increasing is driven by the non-fantastical condition. So you can see here in the plot, the yellow line is non-fantastical, the purple line is fantastical. And so we see as the blocks progress, the children are learning the rule of the task and they're able to increase their anti-saccades accordingly. But for the fantastical condition, the children weren't able to do that. So our interim conclusions from Anti-Saccade is that we are detecting an impact of the cartoon viewing. The interaction is suggesting that that impact is manifested as a difficulty to learn or succeed at the task. So when children viewed the fantastical content, they failed to make the increase in proportion of anti-saccades with block. But what we don't know currently is whether that was a failure to detect the rule. So maybe the rule was quite simple. So you look over here sooner, you get a reward quicker, or maybe there was a difficulty with inhibiting the influence of the distractor. So that's something that we still need to establish in the data. So the final task that I want to discuss is our static scene viewing. So this is something that we showed children before and after the cartoon viewing. So there's 2 blocks. There were 4 static scenes in each block, and each block lasted for 40 seconds. And unlike in dynamic scenes where engagement is maintained by changes in low-level visual features, in static scene viewing, the continued engagement is being driven by endogenous attention, and this is being used widely in developmental studies to investigate sustained attention. And so we're predicting here that we'll see that longer average fixation durations are going to be a measure of sustained attention. So therefore, for the fantastical condition where we expect to see an impact on endogenous attention, we're expecting to find shorter fixation durations. Again, we tested these with generalized estimating equations. Condition is entered as a predictor of the average fixation duration, and we baselined those fixation durations. We have 27 children who went into the analysis, and we didn't find a difference between the 2 conditions. Descriptively, you can see from the plot that the mean fixation durations appear to increase only from pre to post for the non-fantastical condition. And we're in the process of working through what this might mean in our data. So as a sort of interim conclusion, we do find a trend in the predicted direction, but the difference isn't significant. And there's a number of things that maybe can explain why we're not seeing that significant effect, which we had detected with the anti-saccade task. So we have a data loss issue in this task. So as I said, we have 27 children who were entered into the analysis. So these were children who had data at pre and post, which allowed us to calculate a baseline score. And we then had 6 children of those 27 who only contributed data at 1 data point. So the questions in terms of data loss, why we might be losing that data. So is it to do with compliance or temperament difference? So are those who are included, do they differ from those who are fussing out of the task? So is it a willingness to comply or an ability to focus attention? There's also the possibility that it's a familiarity with screens, and this could go both ways. So you're more familiar with screens, you might be more happy to look towards these static scenes, or maybe they're boring and you don't want to look. These are things that we need to think some more about. There's also the possibility that the impact of the cartoons is waning at this point, and which is why it's therefore moved to non-significant, but is still in the expected direction. So just to wrap up, the next steps that we have for our data is to look at the gaze behaviour during cartoon viewing. So we're interested to know how well the children were able to attend to the cartoons and whether this differed by condition, and also how well children could learn new information. So we had a word learning task, which we're going to look at next. And so we're interested to see whether there was a difference in how well children were able to learn, if there's this reduction in executive processing after viewing fantastical cartoons. So just really to wrap up, our tasks appear to be sensitive to the differences in attention an executive function after cartoon viewing and indicate that there is a short-term causal relationship. And this chimes with the existing evidence, and there is a growing body of evidence which shows that there's a sort of enhancement of some skills and challenges with others, both in the short term and in the longer term. So I wanted to touch a bit on longitudinal designs, which this will come a bit more into thinking about causal links as well. So there are longitudinal studies with children the same age as our sample who were high users of touchscreen devices. This is in another project I've worked on called Tablet, and they had faster visual processing skills, but poorer endogenous skills. And so there is a slight overlap here in terms of we may be slightly better at visual processing, but then there's a cost of that, and it's on this more endogenous processing. So more work's needed to really understand where these challenges and enhancements are lying. And then just to sort of fold back to where I started at the beginning, we were really interested to establish whether we could formalize properties in a way that meant we could test their impact on executive function during development, and also whether it's possible to isolate specific events. So we've done that, I think, with our study. We isolated the fantastical events from the other confounding factors. But there's a question about whether whether by doing this, we've actually reduced the potency of the impact. So whether taking away that aspect, the low-level feature differences, whether that is actually part of the effect that's been seen previously. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about here was, this question about how do we test the causal links between the short term and the long term. So in our study, we haven't established whether there's a consequence of the overwhelmed executive function system switching to this bottom-up attention. And this will need to be confirmed, I think, as a first step to starting to chart that short to long-term association. There's always a conversation about whether it's interventions that are needed in order to really test the causal links. I think interventions are very tricky here. It would be very tricky to control the exposure. So basically thinking about how we can achieve repeated exposures of these particular types of events, controlling for all other screen times, I think is very difficult. And so that's a discussion that needs to be ongoing, I think, in the field in terms of how we start to draw those things together. And I haven't had time at all to talk about this here, but there are obviously conversations or questions about individual differences. So how do individual trait differences in children influence these short-term state changes in executive function? That's not something that's been covered very much in the literature to date. And in terms of future studies, there's questions about trying to move our research out of the lab. So we've been trying to develop a task that would be sensitive to testing for these short-term impacts that could actually be conducted outside of the lab. So we wouldn't need children to come in, and we could open it up to a much wider age range. So this is another work in progress. But essentially that's what I had to present for you today. So I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have. And I'll put this slide here in case you want to contact me. Thanks very much.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. My goodness. Yeah, so we have got a couple of questions in the chat for you. So I'll just put them out. So Hagar says she has a question about children's top-down processing of fantastical content and the connection to executive functioning. She asks, are there studies comparing... Oh, my chat's vanished. Hang on. Are there studies comparing how children engage with fantastical content when directed and presented as a video compared to as a book? So as a book, the viewer has more control of the pacing and the direction of attention.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So yes, there are a few studies that have done that. I know of studies also that have, in a sort of, I don't know if you know, but in a sort of CBeebies bedtime story kind of a way, where basically the footage is created a bit more like it's a storybook. And so there has been research into those types of fantastical events, and I think the effects have been less clear cut generally, which I think is not necessarily surprising in the sense that they will, because of this, as you say, so there's this control over the pacing, it will be more muted. So I think that's probably a factor in why it's been harder to establish if it has the same effects. But yes, there is work ongoing looking at what it looks like in a storybook compared to TV shows. Yeah.
That's really, really interesting. And it actually links into our next question. So Andy says, I understand the definition of fantastical effect was pre-established. My question as a former children's book publisher is that I would expect children, even 18 months, to be able to enter the world of the cartoon, which has its own rules, even when it's fantastical. This would include all characters having 3 fingers, as well as no one ever getting hurt if they get squashed. I would find it hard to know what would qualify as fantastical. So that's really interesting. So when you've kind of entered that cartoon world that has its own rules, yeah. Surely children would be able to process that it has their own rules, and then kind of what's the effect? What do you kind of establish as a fantastical event?
So we talk about this quite a lot, and I think that this is definitely a very valid question, because these fantastical events, so violations of physical laws, happen quite often in kids TV, right? But it seems that, or we can take from the evidence that exists, I think currently, that even though they're repeatedly exposed to these kinds of things, there's still a problem with processing them. And this is often a question that we have, which is, why is it not that when you see a particular event, particularly, so if we take SpongeBob SquarePants is a really good example, right? So SpongeBob SquarePants is a sponge, and his sponge shape often changes. So you would think at some point, for children watching that, they would think, that's a sponge that changes shape. I understand that. It's not surprising anymore. And I think that it's hard to say for certain that the evidence that we have and previous studies have had suggest that they're not doing that, but nobody's directly looked at it. And I think it's a really important question. So can we actually assess this sort of model creation? And it's much broader than just in the moment. It's like, what do I understand about a character in a particular world? Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. Really, really interesting. So kind of leading on from that again, so Tom has a question. He says that some research has shown that children look away when the content is too surprising, and that lookaways are more likely at event boundaries. Firstly, do you think this is why children were more engaged with a different medium, the Duplo, as they disengaged from the highly surprising fantastical events in preference for the block task?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so I mentioned that one of our next steps is to look at the gaze behavior while they're viewing the cartoons. And I think this will help us to understand this. So it's definitely true that all of the children, irrespective of which cartoon they'd seen prior to the block task, really liked playing with the blocks. Even children, this is sort of anecdotal, I guess, but even children who were particularly fussy during the cartoons were happy to do the block task. So I think we have to look in the gaze behavior to see whether, yes, there was more occasion of looking away, and whether that differed between the fantastical and the non-fantastical. And I have wondered whether the thing, a possibility about the block task and why the fantastical, after viewing the fantastical content, they actually engaged for longer, was a kind of regulatory activity. They were like, I've been overstimulated by these cartoons, but now I can play with these blocks, and actually that's having a sort of calming effect, possibly.
Really interesting. So the second part of Tom's question, could this high surprise cause a general dip in attentiveness over the task battery, which could explain relative poor performance on the task? I think it's linked.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that if I've understood you right, we're kind of saying the same thing. So when you've challenged children in this way with this particular content, you would expect to see a dip in their performance on a task. And so I guess maybe one of the things there is about the fact that maybe this data loss issue that we have is reflective of this effect of what we've asked them to do.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Claire. So Anna says, could you share your contact details page again?
Oh yeah, I'll share my screen again. Yeah.
Yeah. And I did have a question.
Yes.
So I think it's really amazing what you're doing, actually picking apart these features, you know, that drain the executive functioning skills, and you know, it's that old saying, you know, too much TV rots your brain and such. But it actually seems to be that certain features of TV programs are kind of responsible for that effect. Obviously, you're working in collaboration with Hopster, but I just wondered if you had any plans for sort of communicating your findings more widely to people who are creating sort of visual media. Is that in the process right now? Or?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So we have our industrial partner, obviously, and so there will be a process of disseminating findings to them, but also to their subscribers on their app. We've also done some work already where we've presented to like the BBC research and development departments. I think definitely trying to increase that conversation between research and the content creators would be really great. And also just for my own future work, the information that we could gain from the content creators would be really insightful, I think, because a lot of the things that I've talked about, we assume that that's what's going on for the content creators. We assume that they've realized that they have to make these sort of adjustments in order to help children to engage with it. And it would be really interesting to hear about that process from their perspective. So it is definitely something we're working on.
Fantastic, amazing. So does anyone have any final questions? Unmute or just put them in the chat. If not, then I guess we shall start wrapping up. So thank you so much, Claire.
Thanks so much.
No worries. So before we all head off, I have a couple of just quick notices about some changes to our schedule coming up. So next week, Nandini Singh, who was scheduled to talk with us, has been rescheduled to the end of next term on July the 6th. So she'll end our academic year on a high note. Daniel Ansari, who was scheduled for the week after, will actually now be kicking off our autumn term on October the 12th. He tells me he shall have some exciting new work to present for us by that point. So we shall be very excited for that. So unfortunately, that does mean that this has been our final seminar for the spring term. So thank you again for rounding us off so wonderfully, Claire. But we will be back a little bit earlier than usual with a special seminar from Nienke van Atveld on April the 20th. And she'll be speaking to us about proving or improving yourself, neurocognitive interplay between motivation, learning behavior, and achievement. And to me, that sounds like a must not miss session. Obviously, we'll put all these changes out on our Twitter and we'll keep you up to date on our mailing list. So once again, thank you so much to everyone for coming and being such a supportive audience. And we really, really look forward to sharing more work from some wonderful speakers with you next term from April the 20th. Lovely. Have a lovely rest of your term and a lovely Easter break. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.